Well, hello to everyone. I want to thank you for your participation in this series of discussion on cultural heritage in crisis. The initiative on religion, law and diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and Foreign Affairs Institute, Greece, are organizing this series of conversation to explore the current conditions and contours of cultural heritage in crisis. Framed within this context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the conversation series brings together cultural heritage experts, policymakers, practitioners, and influencers to share knowledge, experiences, and recommendations about sustainable cultural heritage practices at a moment of great risk and at a time of renewed possibility. The first conversation of this series was about why does cultural heritage matter for humanity? And the participants were Dr. Bonnie Doherty from Harvard Law School, who is specialized in world heritage and armed conflict, and Dr. Marios Notas, head of the European Communications Institute based in Athens, Greece. Moderator was Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou from Tufts University, a true pillar of this effort. And at this point, I would like to thank her and her team, Sisi, Francois, and Brad, for all their effort to the realization of this event. Today, we will discuss public-private partnerships, social impact investing, and cultural heritage. And to do so, we have with us three important experts on their field, whom I will present right away. First, Mrs. Cly Wallace, an experienced business communication specialist on a global scale, as she worked among others for Coca-Cola Company, managing a wide range of communication programs in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. She has a special passion for cultural heritage, which is our shared stories, and using her expertise in business communication, sustainability, and information public policy to engage stakeholders in heritage projects. Cly established her independent consulting business in 2001. Also, Mr. Haris Siampanis is the CEO of Benaki Museum, one of the biggest private museums in Greece, with many departments and an exceptional work in the last few decades. Mr. Siampanis has done postgraduate studies in Tufts University and Harvard University. Last but not least, Dr. Stefanos Valianatos is the head of the International Relations Department of the Hellenic Foundation for Culture, and he's also head of the National Network of Anna-linked Foundation in Greece. So thank you all to be with us. To begin, I will ask you to make a 5 minutes introductory statement related to the topic of our discussion. And after that, we will proceed with the questions, some of them from our audience. So please, Mrs. Aramian, Cly, let's begin with you.
Great, thanks very much. So as you say, I come from the world of corporate communications, corporate CSR. I then got a degree at an Institute of Archaeology, and but I came to it with that business background and with a Fletcher background, so it was a little bit coming from a very different angle than a lot of people there. So but that CSR background is really how I'm going to approach this. I talk a little bit about basically private sector interaction with heritage, not talking so much about museums. We have the CEO of Benaki Museum here. Museums are a different case. I think that, they're purpose built for public interaction, and for a variety of reasons, perhaps there's an easier fit with business collaborations. But private sector interaction with types of heritage that are in situ, if you will, whether it's archaeological sites, built structures, antiquities or traditional practices, is more problematic, I think. And it has a checkered history, as one author put it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm also talking about businesses as opposed to private foundations. There are a lot of private foundations out there that support heritage in a myriad of ways, but I'm interested in whether and how commercial interests can be aligned with heritage conservation. A broad question I'd like to ask, won't have time to answer entirely here, is whether or not the discussion, the global dialogue around corporate social responsibility and sustainability presents untapped opportunities for more and better private sector involvement in cultural heritage. My short answer is yes, I think it does. Clearly with dwindling state resources, cultural heritage in the early 21st century is under a lot of pressure to find both new sources of funding and meaning, actually. At the same time, there's rapidly growing public interest in cultural heritage. And since the 1990s, at the same time, businesses are under pressure to define their social purpose in society, to ensure responsible operations, but then to go beyond that with strategic programs to help out with global issues like my old company, Coca-Cola, did with water. And in doing so, to partner with governments and NGOs to get it done and to be accountable to other stakeholders for what they do. So potentially there's a matched interest there. Yet, cultural heritage really has a very marginal place in global sustainability frameworks, including the UN SDGs, and correspondingly in business sustainability guidelines, even for the sectors that arguably are the most involved with heritage, tourism, extractives, and the antiquities trade. Some standards have been articulated, but have in many cases not been very effective. And very few companies out there have incorporated cultural heritage into their own sustainability agendas. All of that said, nonetheless, I think the sustainability dialogue has prompted some innovative approaches, both to protect and to support heritage resources. On the protection side, there are many things we can talk about, perhaps in the discussion, but I think one interesting advance is with lending criteria by development banks. The World Bank is collaborating with UNESCO on heritage-specific criteria. In 2009, in fact, this was instrumental in canceling export credit guarantees for the Ilisu Dam project in Turkey because there were no feasible plans for salvaging a 10,000-year-old city on the Tigris. It was there called Hasankeyf. Also, within the World Bank family, the IFC has drawn up performance standards. And interestingly, they have 8 standards, and an entire one of those is devoted to cultural heritage, which is very unusual in this field. And it talks about both protection and equitable sharing of the benefits of heritage. So placing cultural heritage squarely in the context of sustainable communities, which is a bit rare, actually. And these standards are referred to by private banks, including HSBC. So it's an interesting development. So moving from protection, and there are lots of other things to say about that, but moving from that to support. So I think you might be interested in looking at some of the things that are happening out there. So what's happening? What are the leading efforts to engage the private sector in heritage conservation? How is it evolving in the sustainability context? Well, I looked at this about 15 years ago, and I have to say it hasn't changed a whole lot. There are 2 main NGOs out there channeling, at a global level, channeling private sector funds and partnerships to cultural heritage, and that's the World Monuments Fund and the Global Heritage Fund, based in New York and in California. And they are backed primarily by 2 companies, by American Express, it's been there since the beginning, and now by Google. The World Monuments Fund was the first, it's still the biggest. They worked on preserving more than 600 sites, and raised or leveraged more than $700 million for site conservation. The primary sponsor since 1995 has been American Express. They are, together, these are the doyens of private sector support at a global level for cultural heritage. The approach of the World's Monument Fund perhaps reflects its longevity. It's grounded primarily in the traditional focus on material conservation, which I think you can see in its response to what's just happened with the Hagia Sophia. They put out a statement saying that they don't, it doesn't matter to us whether this is a mosque, or basically saying whether this is a mosque or a museum, as long as the fabric of the building is not harmed, damaged in any way, and there's continued public access. So that's the doyen, if you will. The upstart is an organization called the Global Heritage Fund. It's based in California. It was just set up in 2002, so it only has 28 projects in a handful of countries, but it's very innovative in the approach it takes. In fact, the way it describes itself is transforming local communities by investing in heritage. So it kind of turns the thing on its head and looks at heritage protection as a stimulus to social innovation. And they have some very innovative projects. For example, in Morocco, where they're preserving a series of ancient granaries that were used to store all kinds of valuables by the local Berber tribes there, but not just preserving the fabric, but at the same time working with the community so the community has control of what happens there, and to turn traditional products and practices into sensitive tourism attractions as well, so they can raise money to put back in the preservation. Additionally, they have actually now, because of COVID, they've got something they're calling the Heritage Solidarity, the Global Heritage Solidarity Fund, and they're inviting contributions to give immediate support for the people around a couple of selected sites, particularly right now in Colombia, to help the communities around the sites survive, because basically the sites can't exist if the communities aren't healthy, and at the same time to diversify out of tourism for the longer term for those communities. So it takes some interesting approaches. Another company, interestingly, talked about Amex is Google. Google is now using information technology to digitize collections and to bring cultural heritage to people through an arts and culture app. Actually, it's a fun app. I recommend that you download it. And also it's used it to help communities monitor and manage the impact of climate change. So it's working, for example, in Rapa Nui, Easter Island, to help the community there monitor the damage caused by rising sea levels on the statues. So it's partnering with these organizations and others to use its technology for this. One other example is BMW, which is more involved in intercultural dialogue with the UN, which is a project I was involved in, but also in working on intangible heritage in China right now. There's clear, all of these companies clearly have an interest, a business interest in doing these things. In BMW's case, it's a very significant investment they're making in China to produce electric cars. So, you can problematize all of this, but at the same time, they're doing interesting things in the realm of intangible heritage, talking about their audience being the inheritors and trying to build new ways to make sure that traditions continue. I'm going to mention one other thing while I still have you. At the other end of the private sector spectrum, microfinance. In Mali, there's a very interesting initiative where microfinance banks are actually making loans for sustainable small businesses, for small local business, micro businesses, using cultural heritage objects as collateral. And of course, Mali's a place where it's been very much, raped of many of its movable heritage items because they've become emblematic of African culture and African art. So they take from the local people, they will take these cultural objects as collateral. Then they value them based on the histories that the individual is able to bring to them. So it actually encourages knowledge, and then displays those objects in a locally built museum. And then the monies from that get funded back into the heritage project. So that's another very interesting model that's not corporate, but at the microfinance level. I think that's probably all the time I have. I've probably gone over. We can discuss more in conversation.
Yes, thank you, Cly. That was truly a global view on the subject. I will immediately pass to Mr. Siampanis to give us his view, I presume in a more local aspect. Mr. Siampanis.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to say a few words about the Benaki for those ones they are not aware of. The Benaki is a foundation under private law. It's the largest and oldest private museum in Greece, second most visited after the Acropolis Museum. Was founded in 1930 by Adonis Benakis, who was a Greek of diaspora from Alexandria, to house his extensive collections, which he donated to the Greek state. So this was the first, let's say, public-private partnership for the Benaki Museum. Currently, the Benaki Museum has 10 buildings open to the public, and its collections span from Greek to Islamic and Chinese, Korean, African, pre-Columbian art, modern art, more than 120,000 artifacts. Interestingly enough, we are able to exhibit only 6% of them, which makes relevant why we should collaborate with with the private sector in order to make this accessible to the whole world. Apart from its extensive collections, the museum also houses 4 archives, photographic, historical, architectural, and performing arts archive. The largest museum library in Greece with more than 200,000 volumes, and 7 specialized conservation laboratories. Every year, approximately 900 objects from our collection travel to exhibitions abroad, and we already have established a long-term relationship with the Hellenic Museum in Melbourne, Australia. We were the first museum to open a shop in Greece, and the first to open a cafe restaurant and to organize educational programs for children. Our Museum of Islamic Art is the only one in Balkans, and it's among the top 10 collections of the world. So how is the Benaki working to preserve the cultural heritage? We are focused on the preservation of cultural heritage through the conservation, documentation, study and exhibition of the objects from our collection. As Clyde mentioned before about the digitization of our archives from Google, we're participating in Google Art Project, so we are one of their partners. So we make accessible all over the world to showcase actually our collections. Through our temporary exhibitions, we showcase the work of new and established artists, and we bring our audience in contact with different cultures. Through our educational programs, we bring children, adults, and individuals with disabilities in contact with our collections and cultural heritage in general. We organize around the year tours of the collections, temporary exhibitions and archives, and most important, in order to do all that, we are working hard to raise funds, both by public and private sector. Things have changed. The Greek crisis that was before the pandemic was also very critical in order to shape the future of the Greek museums. And as a result, we had to alternate our operating model and going from a state funding model to a more private funding and earned income model. So in order to do that, we launched, we used the best practices from all over the world, especially the US museums. They are the leaders on this area. So we created individual and corporate memberships. We tried to make tailor-made solutions for corporates in order to become relevant for their CSR and for their causes. We created an adoptions program. I'm proud enough to tell you that 18 of our employees are being adopted. I am one of them. So we introduced an end of the year appeal. We introduced annual galas, fundraising events. We include in our agreements with corporate partners in-kind support. We try to use all our venues for corporate rentals, and we try to fundraise not only in Greece but in all over the world. In order to do that, we did a huge preparatory work in order to be more transparent and simple than ever. So we are proud enough of having audited financial statements in English based on international financial reporting standards, which is not the standard practice for a Greek non-profit. We have developed an ERP and business intelligence system. We already have e-ticketing. It might sound very naive maybe to some other museums, but in the Greek environment, this is not, we don't take this for granted. And coming to COVID-19, we had to face a new crisis after 8 years of the Greek economic crisis, which practically wiped out all our earned income. We remained closed for 3 months. We had to suspend our 1/3 of our employees. We had to give them new tasks, but our financial obligations remained the same. Having said that, we tried to create some new sources of revenues like ESOP sales, book bazaars, Benaki emergency fund campaign, but our job became more difficult than ever because the focus was, as it ought to be, in the health sector, in facilities, in hospitals, and all the interest went to that side. However, we understand the culture as not as a luxury, but as something that will show us the way forward, as in all these years presents the way and our footprint in this earth before we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is very interesting. From my position as a Greek, I know that the work of Benaki Museum is very prominent in this country. But of course, to pass to Mr. Valianatos, I must say that also the Hellenic Foundation for Culture is also doing a great job and also having a strong international presence. There are some departments in Alexandria, Egypt, or Belgrade, or Berlin, etc. But Mr. Valianatos, Dr. Valianatos, could tell us more about that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me for this very interesting and I would say enlightening and also stimulating discussion. The way that you introduced me is very interesting because it illustrates by being the head of the International Relations Department of the Hellenic Foundation for Culture, but also representative of the Hellenic Foundation. I mentioned that because there are two different trends here which are very interesting, and including other institutions like the European Union, National Institute of Culture, the Alliance of Civilizations. So this is, in a way, some would argue that this is an anomaly, something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In what sense? Maybe just for the sake of the audience is that I would like to underline that what we call cultural heritage, it's the result of human activity. And in that respect, if you take it a little bit further, we might say that it's the legacy of a group or society which are inherited from the past generation, but what we consider as the cultural heritage of a society, of a group, of a state, it has gone through a selective process, something that would allow us to create a very solid identity and very coherent and very tangible, and unfortunately, and this is where my political science background comes in, something that would differentiate from the other. In that respect, the current view for a long time, and this is what gave rise to institutions like the Hellenic Foundation for Culture, is the result of the contemporary state system worldwide, which is the nation-state system. And therefore, we tended to identify the cultural heritage of a nation-state system, of a nation-state, of a state, as something unique, as something fragmented from the rest of it. Whereas, as we all know, the contemporary state system, but any state system in the past, it's an artificial creation. And societies are dynamic, are movable, they are changeable, and therefore, what we consider today as a cultural heritage of a group of society or especially the state, it is not necessarily the one which was considered some years ago, but also even today we see a new approach to what we consider. For the sake of argument, if you ever go to Brussels, go and visit the African Museum. And it's very interesting because they are trying to incorporate two different things. On the one hand, the imperial past of Belgium, but at the same time, trying to incorporate it in a more, shall I say, politically correct approach. And therefore, this illustrates that what we consider and what is the cultural heritage, it's also a dynamic domain, but it's also a source of learning. Just giving an example that we can learn a lot from preservation, not only of monuments, but of food, of environmental issues, and so on and so forth, that we get out of it. And also it becomes instrumental in a way for sustainable economic development, and this is what brings me into the other the other two institutions, because by recognizing those what we consider as national or ethnic cultural heritage expressions. By the way, I just want to make a small parenthesis here and say, even though we tend to recognize the tangible vis-a-vis the intangible expression of that, even the tangible ones tend to be an expression of the intangible values and norms and practices and way of life that has existed in the past and the main ideas that existed. So the division of that is essential, but nevertheless, in many cases, they are completely interrelated. And therefore, the division, the separation would not make sense if you want to understand the complete one. So while this one, the institutions like mine developed in order to promote their national history, culture, and history, culture, language, and so on and so forth. Now, gradually, all of them, including the Hellenic Foundation, have moved on and being part of the international community from, shall we say, a nationalistic approach to the dialectic approach. So suddenly we have an inclusion which becomes an essential parameter of dialogue, and therefore it's not only promoting the cultural, promoting our national culture and our national cultural heritage, but also the cultural dialogue and cultural relations with the other institutions, with the other countries and other societies as such. In addition to that, we have recognized that states are not monolithic, and there are divisions within which are related to different approaches and diversity becomes the rule rather than the exception. And therefore, we moved on to the establishment of institutions like the Hellenic Foundation, the Alliance of Civilization, even the Council of Europe includes such programs, which actually promotes the dialogue between cultures. And in that respect, the cultural heritage becomes a space of dialogue rather than competition. Just going back in time, we will recognize, and we have seen that in the Balkans a lot, or even vis-a-vis Turkey, that expressions of cultural expression of cultural heritage that we consider as Greek, they have been contested as others. And I don't want to use any politically highlighted expressions, but I would take an example which is very popular among Greeks, rebetiko music. One of the songs, for instance, you will find that is contested by the Serbs, by the Bulgarians, by the Turks and the Greeks. And therefore, this is the negative side of it, but on the other hand, you can see the positive side that it's a place of dialogue, of cooperation, of working together in order to overpass the points of friction in order to contribute to a peaceful coexistence. Of course, it's also a very important domain in terms of sustainable development and of development in such, and therefore we have the expression not only of creative industries and creative entrepreneurship over there, but also that touches upon, and I think even though Mrs. Wallace had described it, probably a lot within the CSR domain, we see that in the community of the social entrepreneurship, the cultural as well as the environmental elements are essential. And in that respect, as a general trend, the other institution where the Hellenic Foundation is very active, which is the European Union's National Institute for Culture, which is not an institution of the European Union. It's an initiative by the state members whereas initially they were perceived as active in the cultural diplomacy, now they prefer the wording of cultural relations. And even the European Union has introduced a new notion of culture where it's much wider to include cultural heritage, in order to include sustainable development, in order to include relations. And in that respect, it becomes essential for any policy, whether it's of a private company or of a state or a community, if it wants to build relations or if it wants to be relevant to what's going on, that any cultural programs, any activities that such institution would build will be in good cooperation with the local entities. So therefore, understanding the other perspective, which is the cultural domain, and that becomes essential for this successful or sustainable action of those institutions. And hopefully that would gradually move on into a better understanding. On the other hand, in cases like Hagia Sophia or other ones, we can see that the cultural heritage becomes a place of friction or a place of as a threat. And in that respect, we've seen in some cases, I don't want to mention, in some cases of radical expression or extremist expression, their attempts to destroy and wipe out the expression of pre-existing cultures in order to maintain or in order to dominate the narrative through their own culture. So as a nutshell, it's a wide range of institutions where there is a lot of space for cooperation. And then, because of the social entrepreneurship element, but because of the dynamic and the variety of expression, I wanted to dig into the discussion the importance of civil society as an area and as an active, as a third pillar to the private vis-a-vis the private sector domain and cooperation. In which case, you create a triangle which is, if working together, might be extremely productive and extremely efficient, and it is a source of hope. Not necessarily, not always very extremely hopeful, because if civil society as such is still a reflection of the societies at large. I'll stop here, and I hope we'll have space for other discussions.
Thank you so much. So the question is now that if private sector can act as a catalyst between nations in order to promote peace, as like you said, Dr. Valianatos, in cases like Yasofia, how can private companies or entities or even the civil society can work in this aspect? Mrs. Wallace, what do you think about that?
Well, I actually worked with the, mention it, Mr. Valianatos, I worked with the UN Alliance of Civilizations to produce a report on the contribution of the private sector to multicultural understanding. And I would say, looking at that I mean, I think in broad, sort of in principle, you can say that the private sector, for all the ways you can problematize its motives, because it has, because it's trying to make money, because it's not government, it's less invested in some ways in some of the identity competitions that you were talking about. And I think there is room for the private sector to have a positive role in that regard. In fact, you see some companies trying to contribute to that, like BMW, where they actually are supporting, they invented something called the Intercultural Understanding Innovation Award in conjunction with the UNAOC. And it's all about finding and then funding grassroots initiatives by young people mainly that are designed to overcome cultural, the dialogue of difference, if you will, and create dialogue between cultures. And it's so there are companies that have an interest in that. You also see small private sector initiatives. There's a small company I think it's called Food for Peace, that works in Israel, that works in bringing Israeli and Palestinian small businesses together to produce food. In order, it's one step towards, people, as the tourism industry would say, it's, you encounter each other as you work together to achieve a goal, including a profit goal. Cultural differences are irrelevant to that. And as you work together, and the other becomes, instead of becoming an enemy, becomes a partner. And so that initiative has been going on for some time. There are a number of other examples from this report. I'm going to have to think for a second to bring some of them up. But I do think that there is a potentially natural role for the private sector to help overcome in some situations those differences. There are also problems. There was one example of a mine in Indonesia where they were having trouble with the local community that didn't trust them, and basically they took a year or 2-year program together to educate both their the international workers who had come in and the local community about each other's habits. And for example, the need for the Muslims, for the Indonesian Muslims, for their need for prayer and their cultural traditions, that kind of thing. And it was a 1-2 year investment in a process of mutual understanding. Ended up making a huge difference. The mine was going to have to close because of these differences, and indeed it ended up being a thriving place. So I think there is potential for the private sector to do that.
But is there any need for guidance from institutions or from governments in order to bring together these individual private sector efforts? What do you think, Mr. Siampanis?
I think we have to get examples from already existing partnerships, and the role of cultural diplomacy should be upgraded in many aspects. Judging for myself, and it's not because of my profession, when I visit a foreign country, one of the first things that I'm trying to do is to visit the museum, or to visit a place that gives the footprint of their ancestors. What I'm trying to see there is not what they did, but the way they used to think about things. I can claim some examples from our museum. I can see a great exhibition that took place last year, which was the Roads of Arabia, and it was an exhibition sponsored fully by Saudi Aramco. So imagine that is a very big company outside Greece, Middle East, supporting an exhibition in Greece about Islamic art. And that way makes accessible and relevant great things from the Islamic nations and Islamic art that are relevant to the people here, and in that way can educate people about the way that they operate. Another great thing that I can think about is that we run a program which was supported by a big corporate here in Greece, and supporting refugees visits in our exhibitions. So in that way, people from Syria and people from Afghanistan could visit exhibitions of Benaki and educate themselves about the new country that they have get into it. Another great thing is the Benaki presence in Melbourne, Australia. I know that some of you will claim that Melbourne is the third biggest city of Greece, but on the other hand, Melbourne is not only Greeks. There are people from Asia, people from Australia, people from all over the world that they can visit and educate themselves about the Greek, and not only the Greek culture. Another thing is that Benaki owns a Chinese collection. Now we're trying to find a home for this Chinese collection, and we're trying to educate people about Chinese art. I'm becoming specific about Benaki, because Benaki owns a span of different collections, not only Greek collection, and in that way promotes, as Mr. Valianatos mentioned before, promotes dialogue between cultures. And I think this is the only way that we can understand other people and promote peace, promote friendship, and respect about others' rights.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, but again, is there a need of a governmental or more institutional guidance for these efforts or not?
Perhaps can I just give a quick example of that? I think if it's certainly a case in the case of cultural heritage, for example, one of the biggest industries that gets involved with heritage in situ is the mining industry. And because they go in and they, they dig up heritage sites. And in 2003, the International Council of Mining and Metals actually came up with a commitment to UNESCO. They called a no-go commitment, where they would never go on to World Heritage sites, would never operate in World Heritage sites or in a dangerous vicinity of them. And just in 2000, but the problem was that a lot of that commitment wasn't then reflected in national legislation very well. In 2013, the UNESCO called on national governments to try to reflect that commitment in national legislation. And for example, in Western Australia, where there are a lot of Aboriginal sites, there is a law that says that shouldn't happen. But just last month, there were massive protests in Western Australia because both Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton had just gone in and dug up, many different sites even after having gone through the approval process, because the law in Australia wasn't strong enough to prevent that. So from my perspective, I think the private sector has the potential to do good things, but it absolutely requires the participation of governments to encourage and in some case legislate to make sure that it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Valianatos, do you have a comment on that?
Well, you bring on an element which can have ideological parameters, whether we have a liberal approach to the state, the role of the state, or an interventionist approach. So I guess living here in Europe, I will approach it from the European perspective of liberalism in a way. So of course there is a role there, but the state remains a space of competition of different lobbies and different interests, and in that respect, but also it's the only institution that can provide and legislate and put actually the overall picture. But this is why we cannot actually isolate the state from the rest of the institutions that we have already been mentioned here, the private sector and the civil society, because this is a continuous process with regard to all of them. Each one has its role to play, and personally I think that the guidance, I'm not very, I wouldn't be so much in favor of guidance per se, as I would like to see the state as providing the overall framework, in of course a framework that has to be flexible because it will always have to adapt to the new conditions, and then allow for the creative power of the civil society and of the private sector to emerge in accordance with this one. Now, in terms of guidance, this might not, you might approach it as a state institution or not. There are the know-how, there is a lot of know-how, there is a capacity worldwide in different international institutions, in different private or civil society organizations that exist over there. And that's why I'm always encouraging the idea like get involved, be in platforms, be in networks, because this is where you will get all the knowledge required and all the even access to funding that is not available always. And this is the last point I want to make in relation to the state. Of course, as I've said, the state is essential. But remember, the funds available from the state have to operate in competition to other sectors. So the cultural heritage, culture, education, justice, health, all of them compete for a very limited pool of resources. And this is why all the other practices are essential, because it actually, if the private sector and the civil society and all the dynamism and the creative approach they have can be at the hands of the cultural sector or the cultural heritage sector, it actually frees capital from the state that can be used elsewhere, which are also reflected in the cultural heritage. If I'm just taking as an example, I found very interesting, it might be an oversimplification, which took place during the crisis. It was a different approach during the coronavirus crisis. If you remember very well, the Greeks I meant, when the leading personality that was talked about, and that a lot of them argue that, well, we shouldn't make such a fuss because some old people would die. The reaction was a cultural expression. No, they are our parents, or this one or the other. Whereas in Belgium as well as in Sweden, the social distancing was part of the culture and actually failed to reach the results. And not only that, I think in Belgium, the number of casualties raised afterwards when they realized that there were a lot of casualties in pensions and in old houses, in houses where old people live, because this family bond, which is very much present in the Mediterranean, was not over there. So we see that this cultural element becomes essential as a glue that would connect to many different things.
Yes. This brings me to another current issue about the cultural heritage preservation contributing to sustainable communities. Actually, this is a question from Professor Prodromou, which is relating to communities that may be displaced due climate disruption or migration or war. How will displaced communities find new ways to sustain their culture? I mean, can they do it by themselves? Which is the role of private sector of that? Which is the role of governments? Who wants to comment?
In my yes, in my view, the displaced, let's say, communities, they should be helped by a number of factors. One of those is obviously private sector, because they don't have the funds in order to do the things they want. The other one is the governmental sector, because the governmental sector should provide initiatives for the private sector in order to provide the funds. So in my view, it's a cycle. It's a cycle of contribution and people that should be partnering in order to create sustainable communities. Let's say, I take for example Greece. There is no place in Greece without cultural heritage. We can go in places in Greece, find communities that they are displaced. We can have companies there invest in those communities. We can have the government provide initiatives for those corporates in order to invest in these communities, and we can have local museums or local archaeologists or local people with know-how of the area in order to provide the know-how that they need to. For instance, we can go to a place and create a hotel for the visitors of the cultural sightseeing of the area. We have seen that in some areas. I know that there is one preparing now in Sparta, and in my point of view, this would be a great example that they can follow other partners as well in all over the world.
Cly, do you want to say something? I see that you...
Oh, I think it's a fascinating question, actually, what displaced people, what you do with people who've had with migrants and people who've been displaced. I think that's a very interesting answer. I just have one example. There's of trying to highlight those people. In Toronto, the Aga Khan Museum has worked with the Luciano Benetton Foundation on an exhibit called "Don't Ask Me Where I'm From." It's supposed to be an exhibit on it's really on the post-migrant experience, the second generation migrants, and talking about their experience. So I just thought it was an interesting example of somebody that's, at least for the foundation end of the private sector, trying to give voice to people who've been displaced, even if that in that case it's second generation. But there might be room for more creative projects like that to give voice to people who've been displaced.
I can add, first of all, I'm a little bit skeptical with this notion. In what sense? When we have a displaced population now, whether are we talking about people that will manage one day to go back to their place of origin? Or are we going to talk about refugees and immigrants, which inevitably, in the long run, they will be integrated in the local communities and in the hosting states? So this is a little bit tricky of how do we deal with it. But in any case, I just want to give an example First of all, including the Council of Europe has come up with a project which of course had more to do with the integration of those communities locally rather than with maintaining the cultural heritage of the displaced people. Nonetheless, it's based on the intercultural dialogue. This is called intercultural cities, and in the nutshell is that the coexistence of different cultures in the same space, and therefore the need for each one of them to maintain its own culture. So therefore, there's the interesting thing about this project is that it's tailor-made according to each city. It's not a take it or leave it guideline. It is designed between the Council of Europe and each city, in particular to meet the needs of the city. In the case of Greece, Patra is one of them. Now, I have another two examples that, of course, they are not major in size, but definitely are in that direction. One of them came from a social entrepreneur in Sweden, a lady actually, who combined the two. And this is where I'm mentioning that the creative industries and the creative thinking are essential in that perspective. She, as a lady, came up with the idea of making handmade bags. And those bags, and she trained other women to do that. But those bags were not ordinary bags. They reflected their culture, their cultural heritage, their history, and they became extremely popular. And therefore, not only she became a successful businessman, but entrepreneur, I would prefer, but she trained a number of generations to do that. Mm-hmm. And the other one is something which is not, it becomes more and more the case, is the creation of museums which are addressing this issue, like in Kreuzberg in Berlin, or in Marseille, or in Malta. So that where this notion maintains alive. And in other cases, I think in Berlin or in other countries, we see that those displaced or immigrants or refugees are the ones who are trained to become narrators or guided tours, therefore having the opportunity to present the history and the culture of their host country, nonetheless from their own perspective, and therefore being able to also illustrate their own approach and not only their own approach, but their own cultural history and background, and therefore they become financially sustainable, but at the same time they have an opportunity to maintain their bond and contact, and actually an opportunity to outreach those memories in thread to the rest of the population, which in the long run hopefully would create a very favorable audience and therefore a pressure group towards the aim that we all would like to see.
Well, thank you. But let me ask one more question, which is, I think, relevant. We are now after two consecutive crises, one the financial crisis, which began in 2008, and the COVID-19 crisis that is evolving. Under these circumstances, which are the margins for funding for cultural heritage, and where should be targeted this funding, in your opinion? Which are the priorities in that matter? Cly, let's begin with you again.
I think it might be a good idea to begin with Mr. Siampanis from Benaki, because I think you've dealt with that very directly with the museum, yes?
Yeah, I can do that. I think that this is a very difficult era for museums in general, and for cultural institutions, and for non-profit institutions more generally speaking. First of all, we need to have an environment that motivates and provides initiatives to corporates in order to support. I will give you an example which it might sound funny, but it's very serious. A Greek resident, when give a donation, or a Greek corporate, to the Benaki Museum, this is non-tax deductible. A US resident can give a donation to the Benaki Museum, and this is tax deductible. That's, as you understand, might sound funny, but it's very serious because all our donors from US, they take a tax deduction for donations to the Benaki because we have a 501c3 account in US and we are recognizable as a non-profit institution. While in Greece, they actually have a penalty of 0.5% of the donation that we are ashamed to ask this from the donor, and we deduct from the donation we provided this to the IRS. That being said, I mean, I know that we have two different models in Europe and US. Europe is mostly state funded for non-profits, while US is more privately funding. But in order for the governments to reduce funds to the non-profit institutions, they need on the other side to increase initiatives and make it easier for the corporates to support them. This is my point of view. I know that it's a very difficult time for all of us, but we need to make it easy. We need to make it simple, and we need leaders in these industries to lead by example. We have seen that by great private foundations such as Stavros Niarchos, Latsis, Bodosakis, but we need more initiative from the government and more corporates to lead by example and make it easy for them to support non-profits.
I have one question for Mrs. Wallace from our audience, which I will read right now. Can you provide some more examples of how large corporations are introducing cultural heritage into their corporate social responsibility practices?
Yes, I see the question, and also about what the impact is of not having it included in the UN Sustainability Development Goals. There are not many companies that have cultural heritage as a focus of their sustainability goals. I mean, one thing that's happened with the whole sustainability dialogue is that a lot of companies have moved, not entirely, but have partway moved away from a philanthropic model to a model where they need to define what their social role is in society, and then most of the money that they give needs to fall within that. And there are not many companies that have chosen cultural heritage. In fact, I would say that primary ones are American Express and Google, and to BMW to another extent. It's still the case that both with, and that happens because companies are responding to the public demand. So, and then in the public level, in the UN Sustainability Goals, if the focus is on squarely on the environment, in addition to that is, as well as human rights, poverty alleviation, health, and corruption to a certain extent, and in fact, in the UN Sustainability Goals, there is a minor reference to cultural heritage. It's goal 4.11.1, I think it is, and it basically refers to both cultural and natural heritage, the importance of preserving both. And then the actual goal, the actual action, is to increase funding both by the public and the private sector. So it's not at all focused really on heritage or any particular standard. So it's not a focus there, and because it isn't a focus there, it isn't going to be a big focus with companies. So I do think that does have implications for private sector funding. And I think one thing that over the longer term, I think there are a number of things that the heritage sector can do to increase private sector funding, and one of them is the long-term project of getting heritage and cultural issues and cultural heritage included in a vision of a sustainable future, and which it's only at very, very much at the margins of that. And I think I study political science as well, and I would say that there are reasons for that. I think both the heritage community and the development community are grounded in material concerns. Perhaps in Maslow's hierarchy, perhaps that makes sense. They're concerned with making sure that people are fed and healthy, and the whole notion of identity, psychological and social well-being is just not integrated into these things very well. So in answer to the first question, I'm not sure I can talk to you if you want a little bit more about what Amex or what Google or what the Global Heritage Fund is doing, if you want more examples of that. But other than those 2 or 3 companies, there isn't a lot. Some of the mining companies, in this context, it's the companies will do it if it's something that's either directly related to their business, like American Express being a travel finance company, Google because IT can bring the heritage to you, BMW because it was investing in China, or it's because they could damage heritage and it could cause reputational damage. So it's a danger they need to insure against. And that's where the extractives come in. But even the extractives don't really have a lot of, there are a few local initiatives, but they really do not invest in it on a global basis. They have global standards, but then standards that they are not always complying with. So I agree that it's problematic at that point. I hope that helps. I see it does. Okay, good.
So in concluding this discussion, I want to ask one final question and let you make a small final statement, each one of you. And the question is, how can this view of the private sector on cultural heritage can change or can be better? Let's keep the same order. So, Cly, if you like to make a final statement.
Well, I think I've said part of it actually. But I think, there are, first of all, there are things that the business can offer. It can offer not just money, it can offer, relevant skills, employees, marketing, the power of the brand, and it can also help in advocacy. So I think their business, the private sector, businesses, there are things that they can contribute. There are lots of challenges. The lead times of dealing with a company, the management demands, potentially the inconsistency, and the need to show results are all something that don't fit very well with right now with how heritage is managed in a lot of places, at least non-museum heritage I'm talking about. So I think what the heritage sector can do is a few things. And one is at the local level, enhancing management capacity to deal with the private sector. And perhaps what you're saying, Mr. Siampanis, as well, the public sector to facilitate it better as well. And to learn how to target the right kinds of partnerships, do the right kinds of things, and then to enhance standards of behavior, both at the project level, so that, helping, train, if you will, heritage managers to do that, but then also at the global level to advocate. I think there's a big advocacy job to be done at national, international level to bring heritage to the attention of the public authorities and then the private sector.
Thank you, Mrs. Wallace. Mr. Siampanis?
I would say that we all have to do our own job, and we have to do our part, the part that comes to us. If I had to summarize all of this, I would say become more relevant. And by saying that, I mean that you can have corporate support, and this is not only money. It can be services that they are expensive for you. It can be advice that is also expensive for you. And people, they can give that, and companies can give that almost for free. I will give you 2 or 3 examples, and I will close up here. For museums, one of the must-have things is all TV screens, tablets, things that you can marketing your exhibitions, the rights to your members, and all of those. But those things are pretty expensive. So what you can do is partnering with a leading, let's say, telecom company and provide this for free. We have done this with Samsung, for example, and this is a pretty heavy cost that has been deducted from our budget. Another thing for us, which is very expensive, is transferring objects through via aviation. We have partnering with Aegean Airlines, and almost all the flights for things and visitors of the museum is for free. And a last thing about advice is that we very recently introduced a CEO advisor network, which constitutes from people from different industries. It's people with different backgrounds, from banking industry, from marketing industry, from politics, people with total different backgrounds that they can advise me and the museum for things that if we were hiring, let's say, a consulting firm, it would be unsustainable for us. So trying to find ways to become relevant, and sometimes get services that may cost you a fortune.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Valianatos, the last word is yours.
Famous last words, as Super Trump would say. Well, as I've said, and loyal to what I've said, it's a triangle that all of them have to work in as better as possible. The civil society, or shall we say society at large, with the private sector and the public sector. In that respect, the first point I want to make is that if we are talking about major cultural heritage monuments, they have to become socialized in a way. In what sense? The connection, the bond between the locality and those institutions have to be strengthened, because then it becomes part of their life. And once it becomes done, then there is the relevance of the private sector because of the locality. Then we have to give, I think, in general, in terms of the private sector, it needs the incentives to do that, and they are not only financial. It's also exactly the employees of the private sector remains locals in the southern degree, and therefore the well-being or the maintenance or the preservation of their home environment is essential for their living in better conditions. And finally, and of course, it is something that, of course, this role or this behavior of the private sector is different from country to country, from culture to culture. And in that respect, I would argue that probably we need a concentrated campaign, education, so on and so forth, for a mentality change. I'll just give an example, which for me was surprisingly, when I went back and when we were discussing the social entrepreneurship community, we came across some of the documents of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, which is representative of the Conservative Party. And it was very interesting to see that from the 50s, one of the major guidelines of such a party, a right-wing party, was the social responsibility of the private sector. This is what I mean in some degree, that is, we need a mentality shift from all sides. And in terms of Greece, as you probably very well know, is we have to move beyond the demonization of the private sector, the enterprises as such. So this would be essential if we want to move ahead, and the private sector can offer this thinking out of the box, including, when I say the private sector, is the third sector and others. But it is a long process, and unless you have the state providing the environment a stability in a number of, from investment policies to taxation, and knowing the private sector that the taxation would not change overnight, not for the next year, but for the previous year, this cannot be an incentive for the private sector to be involved. And just using from a different domain, in terms of going back to the notion of, to the mentality change, is that probably whether we can manage to switch from profit to forgot the word. Switch the word from profit to a more wider sharing of this profit.
Purpose.
So hopefully we will have better times ahead. So this conversation will have truly new
from
meaning.
Profit to prosperity.
Prosperity, okay. Anyway, on behalf of Dr. Prodromou from Tufts University, and of course of myself, I thank you very much for this thoughtful and very useful conversation. I invite you, if you can, to participate in our next panel tomorrow at noon East time of USA, 7 o'clock in the afternoon in Greece. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Cly, thank you. Dr. Valianatos, Mr. Siampanis, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Real pleasure. Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
Our pleasure.
Keep on
Nice to
doing
meet you
that.
as well.